welcome everybody. So I'm Lauren Aldridge and I work with the Vale Nature Partnership. So if you haven't heard of us before, we are a group of sort of organisations and individuals working together to support nature's recovery in the Vale Glamorgan. The partnership are funded by Welsh Government through the Local Places for Nature scheme, and we've been working closely with Jess from Glamorgan, Vale Glamorgan and Bridgend Bat Group to develop a bat starter package which will enable communities to provide, much needed bat nesting habitat and equipment for monitoring. And that starter package is part of the revised biodiversity grant scheme that we're currently piloting. So that's going to be launching at the end of May, and I can share some more information about that with you at the end of the session. Jess is here with us today to take us through an introduction to bats, their ecology and their conservation. As I said, I'll be sharing sort of links to additional resources and information in the chat, so keep an eye out for these. There's also going to be some time at the end of the session for some questions and answers. So if you've got any questions, either pop them in the chat or do use the Q&A function at the top of your screen, and then we'll try and get through as many of those as we can at the end of the session. If you have any issues or any technical issues, do again pop it in the chat and we'll do our best to help. So I'm going to hand over to Jess now so she can introduce herself and we'll get started. Over to you, Jess.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, so hi everyone. So I'm Jess. So I've been working with bats for about 10 years. So I work as like a professional ecological consultant with my specialism being bats. But I'm also the chair of Vale Glamorgan and Bridgend Bat Group and the treasurer for Cardiff Bat Group. And I've also been a BCT registered bat carer. So that's like someone who rehabilitates sick bats. So sometimes members of the public will find bats or their cats bring them in, or all sorts of situations. And I'm one of the people who would go out and respond to that. So yeah, I've been very lucky to work all over the world with different various bat species. This photo here is not the Vale of Glamorgan, it's somewhere in the Middle East, and that big antenna is for radio tracking bats. So that's when we put little tags on bats and then we try and follow them to find out where they're roosting and what habitats they're foraging and stuff like that. So what we're going to cover this evening, the whistle stop tour, we're going to have a bit of an intro to the British bat species and their ecology, how we go about recording bats and what equipment we need to do that, how can we identify bats by their calls, and then we'll chat a little bit about how we can improve green spaces, whether that's your garden or maybe a local green space to you. And then I'll just go through a couple of our Vale of Glamorgan and Bridgend Bat Group projects that we have done in the last year or so, and some of the upcoming ones that we've got in case anyone's interested in getting involved.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to jump in. Would you mind just sharing your screen as a full screen? If that's okay, just it's a little bit bigger. Marvellous, thank you.
Cool. So around the entire world, there's over 1,400 different species of bats and around 18 different families, and they're finding more and more bat species all the time. So now that we've got genetic methods, that's massively helping us reveal that actually a lot of things that we thought were just one species are maybe like 4 or 5 different species. And even within the UK, genetic methods have helped us discover that we've got species in the last 30-40 years. So people might be familiar with a pipistrelle bat. So in the UK we've got 3 different species of pipistrelle, and in the 1990s, I think it was 1992, they started looking at the genetics of what we thought was one pipistrelle species, and it turned out it was 2 different species that diverged many years ago. So even in the UK, it's relatively recent, some of these discoveries. So worldwide, bats are the second largest order in terms of the number of species. So rodents are the most diverse in terms of the numbers of species for mammals, with bats closely following them. In the UK, we've actually got 18 different species of bat, but not all of the that we call resident. So we also have a few extra vagrant species. So this, and what we mean by that is bats that we don't think are resident. They don't live here year round. They just come and visit for whatever reason. So this video here is actually something called a party-coloured bat, which is a European species that we sometimes get turning up. So usually get a couple of records each year that are sort of around London and the southeast of England, but we don't think currently that these bats live here all the time. It just seems that we get the odd one come over. We do have some species like things like the Nethusius pipistrelle that we have migrants come over from Europe, but we also have resident populations that we believe are here year round as well. So yeah, in the UK, we've also got 2 different families. So you may have heard of horseshoe bats, the Rhinolophidae, and also the Vesper bats, but we'll talk a bit more in detail about those a bit later. And bats make up a fifth of our UK mammal species, so they are quite a lot of our diversity of mammals here in the UK. Bats occur across the entire world except Antarctica, but in temperate regions like the UK and a lot of Europe, they have a very different kind of yearly cycle compared to, say, bats that live in the tropics. So for our bats, this is their sort of generalized bat year that they would do. So all of our bats in the UK are insectivores, and actually 80% of all bat species in the whole world are insectivores. And then there are other things like carnivores, fruit-feeding bats, 3 species of vampire bat, etc. But largely, most bats are insectivores. So what that means for us in temperate regions is there's not an awful lot of insects around in the winter months when it's too cold. So that forces a lot of our bats to go into hibernation. So generally, we're finding bats sort of underground hibernating in these extended, what we call torpor. So they're shutting down basically and having a long sleep during the winter. Then in March and April, they're kind of waking up again. We've got warmer weather. There's a few more insects about. So the bats are starting to wake up. They're trying to put on weight. And then we also have the females trying to find their maternity sites. So you may or may not know that male bats generally live on their own. They're solitary animals all year round. Not true for every single species. There are some things like the Dor Benton's bat that we have in the UK that actually the males form big roosts. They like to live together. But largely, most male bats are solitary. But we do see in most species, the females all come together to form these large roosts and colonies during the maternity period, and they give birth to their young all together, raise their young all together, and then they might go off after that point and go and become solitary again for the winter period. So right now, mid-May, we've got probably quite pregnant animals, pregnant females that are in their maternity roost, kind of getting ready to give birth in June. So bats in the UK generally just give birth to 1 pup each year. A lot of people think bats are like mice, but they're nothing like mice at all, and their reproductive strategy is very, very different. So they have 1 young, and that's each year, and that is it. They don't have multiple litters and multiple babies or anything like that. But the babies do grow quite fast. So from June, you've then got about 6 weeks for the baby bat to go from not able to fly, blind, naked, to a fully formed, flying, independent bat, going out feeding with mum. So by the end of August, we've got a lot more bats around, and the bats' thoughts are then starting to turn to trying to gain weight for the next hibernation period, but also thinking about mating and finding partners. So we have a few different strategies employed by different bat species in the UK, the way they go about mating, which we'll talk about a bit more in a bit. But yeah, the autumn is really about gaining weight, looking for a mate, and then as we get back into sort of December time, looking to hibernate once again. So
Jess, sorry to interject. Can I just quickly, there's a bar across. Are you able to click hide, or perhaps just drag it down to the bottom of the screen a bit?
There, is that gone?
Marvellous.
For you?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, in the winter, bats are looking to hibernate. So to do this, they're kind of shutting down their bodies. So they're reducing their heart rate, they're reducing blood flow to just the vital organs, breathing rate drops, everything just kind of goes into slow motion, really. And so if we're going to do bat recording, if that's what we're interested in, the winter's not a great time to do it. It's not to say you won't see bats out at all. So sometimes there are bats still out in the winter, like they do have to still wake up and drink every couple of weeks. So, and sometimes if they do get desperate, they might come out and forage if it's mild. But generally, it's not when you're going to see the most bats. So generally, they've gone places underground, like caves, sometimes just in like the depths of stone walls, all sorts of different places. So this picture that you can see on the right-hand side is a lesser horseshoe bat, which is a very rare species actually in the UK, but we have quite a lot of them in the Vale of Glamorgan because we're quite lucky here. And then when we come to the summer and we're looking at these maternity roosts, so on the right hand side, yeah, here you've got lesser horseshoe maternity roost in a building. So they're selecting very different roosts when it comes to summer. So in the summer, the females are after places that are really, really warm, that are going to keep their babies really warm, that are safe, that are, you know, not drafty. So very different roost selection process. Left-hand side, again, is a different species. This is actually not a UK species, it's a European species, the Azorean nocturnal bats, but they're very similar to our nocturnal bats, really, but they're more crevice dwelling. So a lot of our bat species in the UK are crevice dwellers. The horseshoe bats are what we call void dwelling. So they kind of hang like a cartoon bat, like you can see in this image here. They're hanging just upside down free from something, whereas things like the nocturnal bats, they tend to be tucked away in something, which is why quite often I meet people when I go to do surveys and they tell me they don't have any bats, but quite often most crevice dwelling species are kind of hidden in places where you would never really see them. They're not necessarily out in the open the way the horseshoe bats are. So yeah, when we come around to the autumn, the bats are thinking about, they're wanting to use something that we call transitional roosts. So these are cooler roosts where they can drop into periods of torpor, and that means they can slow themselves down, which will help them gain weight. Bats typically want to gain 20 to 30% of their body weight in fat before they go into hibernation. So it's quite a lot that they've got to build up. And they're particularly trying to build up this type of fat called brown adipose tissue, which kind of sits across the back of the shoulders. And that tissue, when they want to rouse themselves out of hibernation, that area of fat gets really, really hot. And then the blood kind of flows through the body, through that heated area of fat, and kind of warms the whole bat up. And then when we get to the mating part of the year, so we've got different strategies by different species, and we don't even actually know the mating strategies of all of our UK species. So for things like serotine bats, it's still a bit of a mystery. We're not really sure what they do. But for the species that we do know about, we have these kind of what people term lekking roosts. So things like our nocturals and our pipistrelle bats, they essentially find a roost that is their mating roost. It's usually somewhere kind of along a commuting route that they know female bats are going to be passing by, and they'll sit at that roost entrance and call an advertisement call, hoping that the female bats will hear and be interested and come and investigate. Or sometimes they'll also do something called a song flight, where they kind of fly out of that little roost singing their advertisement calls and back in, trying to get the ladies to come in and join them. We also have something called swarming sites, which are a kind of completely different side of the penny, where we have huge numbers of bats. This is all like our different myotis species. I'll get into what the myotis species are in more detail in a bit, but lots and lots of bats, like many hundreds of bats, coming and visiting these large underground sites and doing, we call them swarming sites because there seems to be swarming activity. There's bats just swarming around, like flying absolutely everywhere in the late night in the autumn. And we think it's almost sort of like a big bat nightclub, where they're coming from all over the country to meet other bats. So they kind of permits the genetic diversity rather than bats being stuck in one area and just mating with the bats that are close to them. In terms of monitoring bats, why monitor bats in the first place? So going out, if you're interested in monitoring bats, is really helpful for conservation efforts in terms of us actually just understanding where we're at. So understanding how many we've got of certain species, what species are rare, what species are common, what species are increasing or decreasing. We particularly within the bat group, and if anyone's interested in joining the bat group, some of the events that you can join in on are going out and monitoring known roosts. So we have known maternity roosts of serotines, of lesser horseshoe bats, that we go out and we monitor every year. So we're going with bat detectors and we're counting the number of bats coming out of the roost. And over the years, that builds up a nice picture for us of what is happening with that roost. Is it increasing? Is it stable? Or is it decreasing? And then that obviously allows us to then make decisions if we're seeing certain patterns, or maybe we need to intervene or do something if things are suddenly dropping. So yeah, it's really, really helpful. It's also really fun. I think it's an opportunity to see wildlife, or experience wildlife is probably the better term, because you can't always see it when it gets really dark, but you get to kind of see this other side of wildlife. Like a lot of us are tucked up in bed completely unaware that there's all these different 18 species of bats flying about at night going about their business. So it's quite a unique, different experience for wildlife monitoring. How do we monitor bats? So There's actually a few different ways that we can monitor bats. Some of the projects that I run with the bat groups, we do something called like advanced techniques, where we're actually physically going out catching bats with nets. We only do this in certain circumstances where we can't get the information with less invasive techniques. But the easiest way and a non-invasive way to survey bats is with bat detectors, going out, surveying, listening to their calls, and finding out what species you've got. So different bat species can be identified by the echolocation call. So by the sound of it and by the frequency that it's coming up as. So we need a bat detector because bats are echolocating at high frequencies, too high for us to hear outside of our range of frequencies that we can listen to. So don't get too worried about this. This is like a spectrogram, which is like a graphical representation of a sound, which is showing a bat call. So these little colors that you can see as like a slight little hockey stick shape is a bat call. So we call each one of these a pulse, and it's basically the same as most people are familiar with whales and dolphins using sonar to find their food and find their way around the marine environment. It's pretty much the same thing for echolocation for bats. So they're making high frequency sounds and then they're listening to the echoes back. So in the UK, our bat species can echolocate, some of them, up to 110 kilohertz, so way outside of our range of hearing. But these calls, despite the fact that we can't actually hear them, can be extremely loud. So some of our loud bat species actually have to contract a muscle in their ear when they're creating this echolocation noise, because otherwise it would actually be deafening for them. So it's up to like 140 decibels, which I think is like louder than an average rock concert. They're creating that sound and then listening to the echoes back, releasing the muscle so they can then hear the echoes when they come back at them. So bat detectors and what ones we want to use. So there's a huge range of different bat detectors that you could use. Just to take you through these three, but there are many more. So this first top left one is something called a bat logger. It's a really good detector. It's got a really high quality microphone on it, and it also records the bat calls. So that means you can go home and download the calls off of the bat detector, and you can look at those spectrograms like what I've just shown you on a computer and refer back to see what something was. And they've got a lot of other cool features, but these ones come in at sort of £1,800, so they're pretty expensive. So if you don't really need those functions, this is probably not the best one for someone who's starting out with bats to use. But if it becomes something that you want to do all the time, then or if you're wanting to do something for like professional bat survey work, then these should probably be a consideration in those scenarios. The magenta bat surveys are probably the best ones for beginners. So you can see they've got a dial on the front where you actually change the frequency. So one of the negatives of that, so the bat logger is scrolling through every frequency for you automatically. So you don't have to do any scrolling. You can just hold the bat detector and you'll hear the calls and you'll see a frequency pop up. With the magenta, you have to be constantly scrolling through. So if you've got your magenta switched to about 40 kilohertz and a lesser horseshoe bat, which echolocates 110 kilohertz, flies past you, you're not going to hear it. So that's one of the drawbacks of the magentas, is that you've got to kind of be permanently scrolling and you might miss things. But they're very good. These come in at sort of 70, £80 a unit. So they're good for beginners, and they're quite fun and interactive as well in some ways, because you get to do the scrolling with them, especially for children. You really like that function. And then on the right hand side, this is something called an echometer touch. So the actual bat detector is just that red bit. So it's a really teeny tiny detector that you can plug into a phone or tablet. These are quite good. These come in at about £300. And they're quite nice because they'll show you the sonogram, so you can see this sonogram on your phone or tablet screen as the bat is flying past. So that makes it quite nice and easy for identifying from the sonogram. It also has something called an auto ID function, which can be really useful, but also comes with a warning. So the automatic ID means that the software will try and guess for you what bat you've just heard. So that can be quite useful if you are new to bat detecting, because it will say, oh, this is probably a common pipistrelle. But a couple of warnings with using any kind of automatic identification software is that it doesn't always get it right. So when you're using that, you have to make sure it's set up for the region of the world that you are in. So if it has like databases for bats around the world, so if you haven't said that you're in the UK, you might start getting all sorts of bizarre species. It's saying that you're recording, but you're probably not. And also it just does get it wrong sometimes. So they're not perfect yet, these automatic ID softwares. So if you do get anything rare, like things like Barbastelle bats, or maybe even just rare for the area that you're in, you probably want to double check with somebody before you go submitting records of things like that, just in case that's got it wrong. So yeah, two families of bats that I mentioned in the UK. So we've got the horseshoe bats and the Vesper bats. So the horseshoe bats, or the Rhinolophidae. So the bottom left-hand corner that you can see here, that face is a horseshoe bat, and part of where they get this name from is you can see it's got these bizarre flaps of skin where the nose is, which is kind of horseshoe shaped. So that's where it kind of gets the name horseshoe bat. And the nose is basically specially adapted. So horseshoe bats echolocate using their nose, whereas the Vesper bats echolocate using their mouth. So that's why the horseshoe bat has evolved this special structure around its nose. It's to do with directing and pushing out that echolocation call and then receiving the echoes back using the nose. Whereas for the Vesper bats, and if I had a Vesper bat just sat in my hand, you might be able to see it sort of like just opening its mouth. Obviously, we can't hear the call because it's too high frequency, but it is echolocating when it's doing that. There are other differences between the Vesper bat family and the Rhinolophidae. One of them being, so obviously bats are mammals like we are, so they breastfeed. So in the bottom right-hand corner, that's actually a horseshoe bat's chest nipple, which is the milk-producing nipple. But horseshoe bats also have a unique, interesting adaptation that when they have their first baby, they also grow a second pair of nipples down at the pelvis. These don't produce any kind of milk. They're literally, they just grow there for the baby bats to hold on to so that they can travel with the babies attached more easily. The Vesper bats don't have this adaptation. They will fly with baby bats on them, but they don't grow extra special nipples to do the job. So yeah, so looking at the horseshoe bat specifically, so the horseshoe bats are really quite rare. Both, we only have two species of horseshoe bat in the UK. Both of them are rare. So this picture on the right hand side is a greater, in the yellow glove it's a greater horseshoe bat, and in the grey glove it's a lesser horseshoe bat, so you can kind of get a bit of an idea of the size difference. So we usually say the greater horseshoe bat is kind of the size of a plum. If you went into say an old building, you saw horseshoe bats hanging up, if they're sort of plum sized, it's probably greater horseshoe bats. If they're, did I just say plum? They're pear sized if it's greater, plum sized if it's lesser. So obviously lesser is smaller, greater is larger. They're free hanging. They hang like cartoon bats, which you can see on the left hand side, which is what we usually think of when we think of bats. And yeah, they echolocate using their nose. So when you go out and you're recording, and maybe you've got your magenta bat detector, to hear a greater horseshoe bat, if they're around, you're going to want to have your detector set to around about 80 kilohertz. If you want to hear the lesser horseshoe bat, you're going to have it all the way up at 110 kilohertz. Whether it's a greater or a lesser, the noise that you'll hear on the detector is this very bizarre alien warble sound, which I've got a video, which I will try and play for you now. So hopefully everyone can hear this. So yeah, hopefully everyone could hear that. So yeah, very bizarre. I'm not sure what else you could describe it as, really. It's just it's completely like any other bat species. So if you go out and you hear that, that is some sort of horseshoe bat. And yeah, and then you can work out from those two frequencies whether it was the greater or the lesser horseshoe bat. So we also then have 3 different species of pipistrelle bats. So horseshoe bats are quite rare. The lesser horseshoe bat, although we have quite a few of them in the Vale of Glamorgan, they're rare across the UK. The pipistrelle bats are pretty common across the whole of the UK, and it's the one reliable bat that if you're going to go and do a bat walk, you're almost certainly going to hear one of these 3 species of pipistrelles. So this is all three of them next to each other. So in this picture on the leftmost side, the largest looking bat in that hand is the Nethusius pipistrelle. The middle, which is the smallest one, is the soprano pipistrelle, and then the one on the end is the common pipistrelle. So Nethusius and soprano pipistrelles also seem to be particularly associated with water, particularly the Nethusius pipistrelles. And the Nethusius pipistrelles are one of the ones that also migrate over from Europe to see us each year as well. So these, similar to the horseshoe bats, the pipistrelles all have a similar sound on a magenta bat detector, but they're at different frequencies. So if you're hearing a wet slap sound or a sound that sounds like a sheet of metal being waved, that's usually a pipistrelle bat. So if you hear that sound, you know, okay, I've got one of the three pipistrelle bats. Then if you look at the frequency, you can, if it's around 45 kilohertz, it's going to be a common pipistrelle bat. If it's around 55, it's going to be soprano. And if it's around 39, 40, it's probably going to be Nethusius. So as a general rule of thumb, the larger the bat, the lower the frequency it echolocates at, and the smaller it is, the higher it echolocates at. So I think there's another recording that we can listen to. We can make this play. So yeah, this is a common pipistrelle. And soprano pipistrelle. So you can hear the kind of wet slap or wavy metal sound there. And if you want to listen back to these, this website that has these recordings is from London Bat Group, and it's got all sorts of information about buying bat detectors and going out doing bat recording, which is quite a useful thing to be able to link back to. So the next set of bats are the big bats. So in the UK, I say big bats because in the UK we just don't really have very big bats. So all three of these bats would sort of sit like head to bum. They're about that big. They'd sit across the palm of my hand. They're just, we don't have huge flying foxes or anything like that here. All of our bats are quite small, but they're big when you compare them to things like a soprano pipistrelle, which are so small they can sort of fit in a matchbox. So obviously that's with the wings closed. So yeah, we call these the big bats because they're kind of as big as it comes. So we've got the nocturnal bat, the Lysa's bat, which is actually very similar. It has a different common name of the lesser nocturnal bat because it's very, very similar to the nocturnal bat, but a bit smaller. And then we also have the Serotine bat. So nocturals and Lysas are actually really difficult to tell apart. If you're doing recording in this southeast Wales area and in the Vale of Glamorgan, you're most likely going to be hearing nocturals. It's generally considered that we don't really have Lysas in this area, but Lysas and nocturals both make this kind of characteristic chip chop chip chop, and it's a slower pace to the call, to the pulses, compared to those pipistrelles that we just heard that were very like quite fast, but they're a bit more like chip 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 chop as they go about feeding for insects. Nocturals are also one of the first bats you'll hear or see out. They're sometimes tricky to see because they fly so high in the sky. So you'll usually hear it on the bat detector and be like, where's the bat? And then when you look up, you'll see a tiny looking, but one of our biggest bat species, just because it's so high. So yeah, these, because they're big bats, they're all down at low frequencies. So nocturals around 20 kilohertz, Lysas around 25. The Serotine is a bit more sounding like a pipistrelle bat, and its sonogram looks like those characteristic hockey stick shapes, but it's down at 30 kilohertz, and it's doesn't have the same sort of constant rhythm to it. So it sounds a bit more like, people say it has like a jazz rhythm, like a very up and down kind of all over the place. If you are interested in hearing what Serotines sound like, we do monitor, and we have coming up in June 2 counts for a big Serotine roost in Llancarvan. It's a really good opportunity to go, and you can hear them on a detector because that's the only bat that's coming out, but also see them as well and get your eye in for how big they are. They fly quite low, and they'll usually do like a circle of everybody before they go off. So it's a really, really good event to sort of learn bit by bit, like, because this is a lot of information I'm about to throw at you in this webinar. So it's quite good to go out and do single species stuff where you can go, okay, I know that sound now, makes it a bit more digestible. We'll just have a listen to the chip chop of a noctule. which goes like this. So you can hear that chip, chop, chip, chop, chip, chop pretty easily there. So the myotis bats are a bit of a tricky group. So we've got 7 different species. So myotis is the genus name. So we have the genus and then the species. So we have 7 different species belonging to the myotis genus in the UK. Now, some of these bats are extremely rare. So one of them, the greater mouse-eared bat, there's actually only 2 individual greater mouse-eared bats known in the whole of the UK. They live in a tunnel, I think it's in Sussex. And well, until last year, there's now 2, but previous to last year, we actually only knew of 1 individual. We used to have maternity roosts of greater mouse-eared bats all along the south coast of the UK, but they've slowly disappeared. And unfortunately, this bat is become essentially, although we have the 2, essentially they're functionally extinct in the UK now. But our other 6 myotis bats, so I don't think we'll be hearing greater mouse-eared bats in the Vale of Glamorgan when we go out recording, but we might hear some of the other 6. So the myotis bats are difficult because they all have very, very similar echolocation calls. And they're very, very difficult to say with any confidence that it is one myotis species or another. So just to run you through some of the pictures that we've got on this slide. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you've got a Branston whiskered bat side by side. These 2 are really difficult to tell apart even when you've got them in the hand. And the reason that they're being held like that is to look at the genitals, because the penis morphology is different on each species. And that's one of the ways that you can tell them apart. So telling them apart by echolocation calls is also difficult / impossible. Then the picture next to that is a Dorbenton's bat. You sometimes can actually work out Dorbenton's bats. So Dorbenton's bats are very heavily associated with slow moving watercourses, and they trawl. So they use their feet. They've got much bigger feet than other bat species, and they use their tail membrane to flip up aquatic insects off the surface of the water. So if you're out with your bat detector and you've got it tuned to about 35-ish, and you can see that trawling behavior, you can see these bats going across the surface of slow moving water, you can kind of start to put 2 and 2 together and go, that might be a Dorbenton's bat. And then the other bat next to the Dorbenton's is a Natter's bat. That can be in all sorts of habitats, woodlands, can be out foraging over nice grasslands. And then the big picture of the bat that we have on the right hand side is a Beckstein's bat, which I think we're quite unlikely to get in the Vale of Glamorgan. That's another very rare species that we don't have any records for in this part of in this county. But you never know, they could turn up, but it's also unlikely that we'd be able to work that out from our bat detector recordings. That's really something we need to trap out if we're going to find out whether it's there or not. But yeah, but if you have any myotis species, any of these, what it will sound like on a bat detector is a series of dry clicks. So it doesn't have that wet slap or wavy metal kind of sound to it. It's got a much drier tone. So if I just play for you quickly a Dorbenton's bat. So you can hear it's a much drier tone to it than the pipistrelle bats that we heard earlier. So if you hear that and you've got your bat detector around 40 or 50, you've got one of the 7 myotis bats, but it's hard to say really which one, but you can still say you've got a myotis bat. The barbastelle bat. So the barbastelle is also a really, really rare bat. I think it's about 4,000 we think we have in the whole of the UK, but they're very special. They're very different from any other bat species that we've got. You can see a very bizarre face with weird ears that meet in the middle. They are really moth specialists and woodland, ancient woodland, they really like, and they travel really large distances. These bats, you're going to hear it around 30 to 35 kilohertz if you hear them. And they sound like an impatient knocking on a door. So like a, like very quick. But yeah, if you do go out and you hear anything that sounds like a barbastelle, let us know, because we have a barbastelle project that we're doing where we're trying to find barbastelles in the Vale. And then the long-eared bats. So we've got 2 species of long-eared bat in the UK. One, the brown long-eared bat, which is one of our most common bat species that we have. They really like woodland. And then the grey long-eared bat, which is one of our rarest UK bat species. So they're also known as whispering bats, and that's because they are so quiet. So even if you go out with a bat detector, it's actually quite hard to hear the long-eared bats because the echolocation call that they make is so quiet. They also don't always actually bother echolocating, so you can see the size of the ears on these bats, and they've also got quite big guys compared to other bat species as well. So they actually do a lot of hunting, like what we call gleaning. So they flutter, they're very slow flyers, and they kind of flutter along vegetation, and they'll just glean and take insects off that are just sat on vegetation, as opposed to hunting like active moving insects the way that things like pipistrelles do. So because of that, they're not always even using their echolocation, so it's very difficult to actually pick even brown long-ears, which are very, very common. It's actually quite hard for us to record them. If you do manage to hear them, it sounds on a detector like flicking through like a yellow pages, so it's a very like quiet page flicking sound. So you've got to be quite on it and being quite quiet yourself to pick it up. You can't actually tell using the spectrogram sonograms, you can't tell a brown long-eared bat from a grey long-eared bat. And actually, even when you have them in the hand, they're quite difficult to tell apart, because brown long-eared bats, when they're babies, are very grey, and when they're juveniles, they're quite grey. So they're very difficult bats to separate. But we don't have any records for grey long-eared bats in the Vale of Glamorgan or this part of Wales. So it's probably unlikely that it's going to be grey long-eared bats. So it's probably going to be brown long-eared bats that you're recording if you do hear them. So this is just a brown long-eared bat, just so you can see the ridiculousness of the ears. This was one that we caught during a meiotis project. So one of our research projects we run is going out catching bats, because we're trying to find out more about the meiotis species that we can't work out the species without catching. But sometimes we accidentally catch other things that are not meiotis bats as well, like brown long-eared bats. So yeah, that's the long-eared bats. They also have a kind of hockey stick shaped call, but it's a bit lower down, sort of more around 30 kilohertz and it's just that very quiet sound. There's also a lot of other sounds that you might hear when you go out with a bat detector. So the bats make other sounds. So there's the feeding buzzes that they do, and this is when basically when the bat is putting out its call and listening to the echoes back, once it hones in on an insect, it suddenly needs a lot more in-depth detailed information. So it suddenly puts out a lot of very quick succession pulses that are very close together. So you'll hear a bat being like, and then it's like caught the insect. So you might hear that, and that's them feeding. So that's something that you can also mark down, because then you know, like, oh, this species is actually foraging here, which is something that's quite interesting to us. Is it just foraging in that habitat, or is it just commuting through? You also might hear social calls as well. So bats, the echolocation call is just one type of call that bats make. So they also make social calls, and we get a lot of these, particularly in the autumn when they're getting into the mating period of time, presumably advertising to other bats. And we also have like distress calls. So bats also do make sounds that we can hear with our own ears as well. So if you do come to the serotine count that we do, you can actually hear the bats kind of squabbling inside the roost before they come out, which we think is maybe like a squabbling about who's going to leave first. Not really sure, but there's a lot of other communication, some that is actually audible to our ears and some that isn't. There's also other sounds that there's a lot of things that give off high frequency noise that we don't normally hear. So when you go out with your bat detector, if like say you jangle your keys, or if you just like rub your fingers together, you can, which normally makes really no sound, you can hear a lot more sound to funny things like that. Electronic devices, if you're under things like the pylons, like the foam pylons and the electricity cables, those can all give off funny sounds. Car brakes are one of the worst things to hear through a bat detector. It makes an absolutely excruciatingly awful sound. But also other animals as well. So crickets, which obviously we can hear with our hearing range, but they also are making a call that results in a sonogram that you can then see on your bat detector or see on the computer afterwards if you've got a recording bat detector. But also things like shrews, rats, they also all make high frequency noises as well that you might pick up. So there's an awful lot of things that are not bats that you might also hear when you're out bat detecting. So in terms of resources, this first link is like a key that's just something that might be useful if you want to get into bat recording to print off with you, just to remind you of some of those frequencies and the kinds of sounds for each species that you might hear. If you really want to get into it and want more information, these books are really, really good for this. Is That a Bat is a really good guide for all the different noises that you're going to hear that are not bats. And then social calls, and this is like the guide to species identification for British bat calls, is kind of all the echolocation calls that I've just gone through. Yeah, and submitting your records. So if you do go out bat recording, it's great to submit your records to SUBREC for us here in the Vale. But do make sure, if you are going to submit records, that you are confident of what it is before you do. I think often SUBREC also do prefer you to submit your records with an actual spectrogram, so that there's sort of something to back up your record of why you think you've recorded a soprano pipistrelle or a barbastelle or whatever it might be. But yeah, it's really useful information for the Records Centre to have. So if you can submit your records, that is great. And then moving on into improving things like green spaces. So there's lots of stuff you can do to draw more bats to where you are. It doesn't matter if you've just got a small garden or a local green space, whatever it is. It's always good, I think, to look at what you have first and then kind of adapt things. So like, for example, if you do have lots of trees, if they've already got lots of features like woodpecker holes and hazard beams and snap branches, then maybe putting up bat boxes is a bit superfluous. Like maybe you could concentrate your efforts into other things like planting wildflowers or something. But if you have got lots of young trees that don't really have places that bats could roost, then you might want to think about putting up things like bat boxes. So you can see on this big picture of this tree here, these are what we call Kent style bat boxes. There's lots of different bat boxes, like styles of bat box. They all suit crevice dwelling species, so you're not going to get things like horseshoe bats using these, because they have very specific different, they can't do crawling. But all of our Vespa bats you can find in bat boxes like this. You can buy these, you can also build them yourself, so there's a lot of guides online to building various different styles of bat boxes. And then you can see this is actually, I think, taken from, this is a pipistrelle bat in a bat box at the Amelia Trust farm that they have on a tree there. So yeah, and obviously you don't really want to go and shine lights on them, but if you do want to go and monitor them, you just need to get somebody who's got a bat license to come and help you do that if you don't have one yourself. In terms of putting bat boxes up, the best place is to put them on a southern aspect. So bats really like to be warm. So not like birds, which you're normally putting on sort of like north facing aspects. For bats, you want it on the hottest side. So you want them in sun on the southern side. As high as possible is the general advice that we give, but it's not that bats won't use them low down, but more to do with if you've got lots of predators like cats and things around, or people that might interfere with them as well, then it's better to have the bat boxes a bit higher up. Other things that you can do that are helpful for bats. So yeah, retaining standing deadwood's a big one. If obviously there's sometimes a conflicts of interest if that's going to compromise safety of footpaths and things like that. But if you do have standing deadwood anywhere in your garden, woodland, green space, if you can try and keep that up so that bats can use it, because it will naturally rot away and create features for them. And also insects rely on it as well, which is then the food for the bats as well. If you've got waterways, or even if you don't, any kind of water is going to draw bats in. So we've got a lot of bat species that are dependent on water for the aquatic inverts, but also all bats, like all animals, need some kind of water source, so they come down and drink. So anything that you can create, if you can build a pond, that's amazing, but any little water feature that you can create somewhere is brilliant for bats. And then yeah, just planting a diversity of plants. So butterfly conservation has got some great resources for things that you can plant in your garden that are going to draw lots of different moth species. So things like that, thinking about all the steps basically. So you need to have a good diversity of plants, so you have a good diversity of inverts, and then you're going to have a good diversity of bats. Another thing you can also consider, if you've got local green spaces that you're responsible for, is maybe even things like screen planting. So things like light pollution are not brilliant for bats. So if you can make those places, some things like the pipistrelle bats don't mind the light so much, but if you're in a place maybe where you're on the edge of woodlands and things, screen planting can be really good to try and block some of that light spilling, which will help things like the horseshoe bats, which really do not like light whatsoever. So yeah, I'll just take you through a couple of projects that we have run or are running as part of the bat group. So during COVID, I think it started, at the back end of COVID, we started the Vale Barbastell project. So this was actually kindly funded by the Vale Nature Partnership, and we're looking for barbastells in the Vale of Glamorgan. So prior to this, we didn't have any records of barbastells. Having said that, we did have a piece of work that was done by Natural Resources Wales, that was habitat suitability modelling, and that project had found that there was suitable habitats in some of the woodlands spread across the Vale of Glamorgan that could have barbastells in. So with the funding that we had from the Vale Nature Partnership, we bought something called audio moth detectors, which are these very teeny tiny bat detectors that you can leave out. So this isn't like the magentas that we've looked at today. This is a bat detector that you can just leave out, stick it in a tree, and it's just there picking up bat calls for an extended period. So then we go back 2 weeks later and we can take the SD card out, change the batteries, and then go home and look on the computer at what it's picked up. So we had lots of volunteers helping us across the Vale who were going out and maintaining, deploying these static detectors, and then maintaining them, changing the batteries, changing the SD card, having a look at the data for us. Unfortunately, we didn't actually find any barbastells, so we ran this for about a year. So we had a year's worth of data at all these different sites that should be good for barbastells, but we didn't get any barbastell records through the project. And since the project, we have had ecological consultants pick up one record of a barbastell bat around the Wembo area. So they definitely are here in probably very, very small numbers. But yeah, they are in the Vale, but they are tricky bat to find, it seems. This year we're looking at a new project that we're currently in the process of organising, trying to get licenses for, where we're going to be doing a bit more research on the serotine bats that we have at Llangcarvan. So this project is going to be looking to radio track them. So this, the serotine bat actually got kind of declared as vulnerable to extinction in England and Wales a couple of years ago, and it's very data deficient. So there's things that we try and work out about bats, like core sustenance zones, which is like the area that a maternity colony of that species needs to survive. We've got very little information on serotine bats about what that core sustenance zone is, where they want to forage, what's important to them. And it's also quite important for us to know that about this roost, because we don't have any other enormous roosts like this of this bat anywhere close by. So it's important for us to know how they're using the landscape so that we can protect certain features, woodlands, etc. So that's something that's going to hopefully be starting this September. If anyone's interested in joining, you might want to come and check out the serotine counts or any other bat group event before that, because the tracking is quite hardcore. We go out from sunset to sunrise, chasing bats around, trying to work out where they are and what they're doing. But if you are interested, I think it will be a really cool project where we learn a lot of really valuable information for something that's quite data deficient. So it should be hopefully a very useful study to run. And yeah, if you want to join the bat group, you can find us on Facebook. We also do have a website where you can join. There's like an online membership form that you can sign. But the Facebook group is where we advertise all the events. So that's where you're going to want to go to see what's going on and have all the details of where you want to go and what you want to do. So I definitely recommend that if you're interested in bats. And like I said before, you can then go to these events where you can go and see these different species, hear these different species, and take and learn that information in kind of small, bite-sized, digestible pieces. And that is all that we've got on that. Unless anybody's got any questions, I'll just try and get out of here.
Oh, thanks, Jess. That's brilliant. So yes, lots of useful information and facts to take in. I did share a number of links in the chat during that talk, but what we will do is we'll follow up with an email to all the attendees of the session, and we'll send you all of those in a list, so you've got time to go through them all. But as Jess said, I would thoroughly recommend going onto the website and onto the Facebook group, so you can access all of the project resources and links to forthcoming events. We do have an event next week with Jess where we're going out and doing some using the bat detectors. It is sold out at the moment, but we do have a waiting list, so I will share the link in the chat for you if you did want to join the waiting list should any places come available. We have a couple of questions, so I'll just fire away if that's okay, Jess. So the first one is sort of what habitat is sort of best for bats, and what can I do to sort of improve biodiversity to encourage them?
So the habitats kind of vary depending on the species. So some bats are very, very reliant on woodland. So things like the barbastelle and the Bechsteins, they're really woodland specialists, and they want to be really in quite old, ancient woodlands. But then you've got other things that are more adapted to like edge habitat. So things like the serotines, the pipistrelles, those are the ones you're going to find along sort of woodland edge. Or even sort of in more urban habitats as well, because they're a bit less fussed about things like light pollution. The Benton's bats, you've obviously got on those slow moving watercourses, and then you've also got things like not serotines, soprano pipistrelles and Nethusius that have this sort of affinity to freshwater habitats as well. So it kind of depends on the species. And if you have, say, a green space that's got a variety of different habitats and you're doing bat detecting, you probably want to walk a route that's going to go through all those different habitats to pick different things up. And then in terms of, I think the best thing to try and increase bats and increase the number of species that you've got is really to try and just make the habitats that you've got in a space as diverse as possible. So it's good to have a bit of grassland, a bit of rough grassland, a bit of scrub, a bit of woodland if you've got a site big enough to support woodland or trees, water source of some sort. That's probably the best way to go. Just increase the diversity of plants that are there, and then hopefully you should get lots of bats.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you. And then the next question is, do I need a license for installing a bat box?
That's a good question. So to put a bat box up, you don't need a license. The only point where you need a license is if you want to come back and see if bats are using it by shining a torch. So some of those bat boxes, like those Kent style ones, you can shine a torch up because they're open at the bottom, so the bats drop out the bottom. So those ones you can shine a torch up and see where there's little bat faces looking back at you. Or there's other styles of bat box as well where they have like a door that you can open from the front and take the bats out. So if you're going to be doing anything like that, disturbing bats with a light, so it's illegal to disturb bats when they're roosting, and it's illegal to handle bats without a license. So if you want to do those and come back and monitor them, you would need a license for that. If you don't have a license, you can also contact the bat group, and we have lots of people with bat licenses who would be happy to come out and check your bat boxes for you. Some people say you can check things until you find a bat, so there's nothing wrong with going and checking with a torch your bat box, but at the moment that you find a bat, then you can't go back and check again, because then you're going to be disturbing something that's protected. So but for just generally putting bat boxes up, you're fine to go ahead with doing that with no license, but you do need landowner permission.
Yeah, brilliant. And I guess kind of following on from that a little, is if a member of the public found an injured bat, what's the sort of best course of action? So again, would they contact a local bat group, or is there sort of a hotline or somewhere that they can contact to assist?
Yeah, so there is the Bat Conservation Trust, which is like the national UK charity for bats. They run a helpline that you can ring, I think all year round, that will put you in contact. They basically have a map of people that do bat care and rehabilitation all over the UK, and they'll be able to give you the numbers of the people that are closer to you. So then hopefully someone can respond. If that for some reason there isn't, some parts of the UK where you wouldn't have too much trouble in the Vale of Glamorgan, I wouldn't think, but they are all volunteers, everyone who does it. So sometimes when people's lives get busy with other things, moving house, having children, there may be not so many volunteers available. So, and everyone's also working full-time jobs as well, so people can't necessarily drop everything and come and get a bat straight away. But if you can't get hold of people, you can also take them to a vet as well. And we generally say if you do find a bat, you don't need to be scared of bats, but you probably will have noticed throughout this presentation, I've got gloves on the entire time when handling bats. So like, they are wild animals. They've got saliva with germs in. Rabies in the UK has been found in some bats, but it's in an extremely small number of bats, and not in all species of bats. It hasn't been found in the UK. So it's not something to be super worried about, but you do have to be sensible and make sure that you're trying not to make skin contact with the bats. We generally say if you can pick them up like a spider, so like put a glass over them and then something underneath, and then put them in something like a shoebox with a cloth, with just like a little bottle top of water is great, and then they'll be quite happy there until somebody can come pick them up.
Excellent, thank you. So I think we've got one more question. So I know we mentioned a little bit about submitting our records and things. So what's the sort of best national survey, or are there certain sort of survey schemes that people can take part in, and kind of what time of year is sort of best to do those surveys?
So there is if you have a look at the Bat Conservation Trust website, they have a number of different kind of national monitoring schemes that you can contribute to. So they do something called waterways surveys is one of them. And that surveys, so they basically have a number of sites, and you can look on their website, I think, and see which sites are near you that they want surveying, and then you can sign up to go survey them. And depending on which scheme you're signing up to, they'll have guidance about like what time of year you should do it. So for example, for the roost monitoring that we do, that's part of the national bat monitoring program that BCT run, and that has to be 2 counts both in June. So that's because we want to get the number of adult bats before the baby bats are there. But the waterways surveys is a bit different, and I'm not sure off the top of my head what time of year that is, but there's lots of different kind of surveys like that the Bat Conservation Trust run that you could specifically sign up to if you want to, or you can just go out doing kind of general recording if you have your own bat detector as well, just in your local area if you just want to see what's around. We also, with the bat group, have got quite a lot of these audio moth detectors that we can give out to you to use if you want to put them, if like you want to put them out in your garden for an extended period, because obviously we don't want to necessarily go out bat recording walking around with a detector all night. So if you want to put a bat detector out in your garden and see what's there for like 2 weeks, we can give you a bat detector to borrow to do that as well.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Jess. So yeah, I think that's all the questions. Just had a quick look on the chat. So there's nothing else that's come through. So yeah, firstly, just want to say thank you so much for your presentation. And as we mentioned, this is being recorded, so we will upload this to our YouTube channel shortly, and we'll share that link with you so you can have time to go back through it and refresh yourself with all the information.